The train had long since gone, left only the scent of coal and a humming rail that no one noticed anymore. No one except the girl who had arrived on it 3 weeks past, with a satchel too light to hold hope and a silence that wrapped around her like morning lace. She sat most mornings on the bench outside the general store, under the creak of a warped awning that whispered with the wind, back straighties forward, hands folded on her lap like she was holding something sacred or broken or both. The town of Harlow Creek had seen many pass-through drifters, dreamers, desperates, but it had little patience for those who lingered without purpose, and to them, she lingered. They called her the quiet girl, said she was strange, said she didn't belong. Some claimed she was slow, others thought she was proud. No, one asked her name. They didn't need to. She wasn't here to stay. She walked with a slowness that didn't match her youth, as if every step came with a memory she didn't want. And when she finally let herself settle on the edge of that wooden bench, she did so with a wince. She tried to hide behind stillness, but you can't hide pain from a place that's seen it before, and Harlow Creek had seen its share. The preacher's wife saw the girl shift in her pew each Sunday, never lasting more than a few hymns before stepping out into the sunlight. The air outside was easier to breathe. The midwife saw her flinch when someone reached for her arm too quickly, not the kind of flinch that feared pain, the kind that remembered it. Even the children saw it. But children are kinder than adults. When they don't understand something, they asked her if she liked peaches, if she knew how to skip stones, if she had a name for the cloud shaped like a horse above the schoolyard roof. She smiled at them softly, like someone who hadn't had a reason to smile in a long time. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice sounded like rain on dry dirt, gentle, unfamiliar, and welcome. She had been staying in the back room of the dressmaker's shop, a place offered half out of charity, half out of guilt. The dressmaker was a widow with a sharp tongue but a surprisingly soft heart. She didn't ask questions, just handed the girl a needle and a pile of ripped seams, told her she could stay if she stitched straight. It was the blacksmith's son who first took notice, tall, handsome, sure of himself. He whistled when he walked past, tipped his hat, told her she had kind eyes. She never asked for his attention, but, like so many men, he gave it anyway. He brought her lemonade once, on a day when the air was thick enough to hang from. She took it with a nod, sipped it slow, thanked him without looking him in the eye, and for a while, he kept coming around, offered to walk her home, asked if she liked music, asked if she missed wherever she came from. Then one day, when he sat beside her on the church bench, too close, too sudden, she whispered, voice barely there, "It hurts when I sit." It was not a complaint, not a warning, just a truth, dropped like a coin into a wishing well, with no hope of it being returned. He froze. She saw his face. Changed, first confusion, then pity, then something worse, fear. He stood up, smoothed his vest, said something about needing to check the forge, and left. He never spoke to her again. That was when the stares started to turn. The whispers sharpened. The women at the well pulled their children close when she passed. The men grew quieter. When she entered a room, she hadn't named anyone, hadn't told a soul what had happened in that grand house on the hill. She had worked as a maid for a widower with hard hands and sons who thought silence was consent. But silence in a town like Harlow Creek is loud, and hers rang like church bells. No one asked, because to ask would mean hearing, and hearing would mean choosing sides. And no one wanted to stand on the wrong side of power, so they looked away. One day, as she sat outside the mercantile, watching dust rise from the hooves of horses she didn't know the names, Eva, boy no older than 7, shuffled up beside her. He had a lopsided smile and straw-colored hair, held out a peach with both hands, as if it were a sacred offering. She hesitated, then took it. The juice ran down her wrist. When she bit in, warm, sweet, alive. He grinned, skipped away. Without asking for anything in return, she wiped her mouth with the hem of her sleeve and, for the first time in a long while, looked up. There, across the street, a man stood beside his wagon, loading crates with methodical care. He hadn't looked at her once, but she felt his noticing, not in the way the blacksmith had looked, not in the way the townsfolk, the idea in single quotes, just an awareness like a lantern in the fog. She didn't know his name, he didn't know hers, but when he passed by minutes later, he tipped his hat not with flirtation or duty, but with a quiet kind of respect, the kind given to someone who has weathered a storm and still stands. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. Sometimes, when a town turns its back, the world sends someone who faces you fully, not to fix you, just to say, I see you. The freight wagon rolled in just after dawn, drawn by 2 tired mules and a man who looked like he had lived 3 lives already. Not old, maybe 35, maybe less, but his face had the kind of quiet that only comes from long winters and long silences. He wore no badge, bore no weapon, just a wide-brimmed hat, worn soft at the corners, and a long brown coat faded from sun, not fashion. The folks in Harlow Creek didn't pay him much mind. Newcomers were common, drifters, laborers, peddlers, with nowhere else to be. They stayed a while, then vanished into the prairie wind. But this one was different. He didn't drink at the saloon, didn't try to charm the preacher's daughter, didn't tell stories about where he'd been. He just worked. He took over the freight deliveries when old Clem passed, steering the mule cart from the depot to the town's outer farms with hands steady as prayer and eyes that missed nothing. Not the broken slats on the schoolhouse steps, not the cat who always waited at the bakery door, and not the girl on the bench. He first saw her on his 3rd day. She was sitting outside the mercantile again, skirt brushing the wooden boards, hands folded like always, but there was something in her posture. He recognized the way she held herself, just so, like a body that had learned not to trust its own bones. He didn't stare, didn't nod or speak, just noticed on, went about his route. But every day after, he saw her again, in the same spot, or walking slowly past the well, or reading beside the dressmaker's door, lips moving softly as if reciting each line to the air. Once he passed her on the road. Her basket had split at the handle, spilling apples into the dirt. 3 people had walked by. One had even stepped over the fruit. He said nothing, just knelt, gathered them back into the basket, mended the broken handle with a strip from his satchel, then placed it gently in her arms and walked away. She didn't thank him, not aloud, but the way her hands clutched the basket. He noticed that too. The townsfolk had their theories about him. Keeps to himself too much, probably hiding something. Doesn't even go to church. But the innkeeper, a widow named Mercy, with sharp eyes and a softer soul, saw him for what he was, a man who asked for no place, but left every place better than he found it. She offered him a room, cheap, and he paid every week, in coin and firewood. He never asked about the girl. But one evening, he left a small tin on the stoop outside her door. Inside was a salve, homemade, herbal, healing, and tucked beneath the lid, a single pressed wildflower. Only one person in town collected wildflowers that summer. Little Mabel, the baker's niece, a child too wild for dolls, too soft for chores. She had followed the freight man around for weeks, declaring him her shadow friend. She had told him all her secrets, showed him where the monarchs laid their eggs, and once, she said, "That girl looks like she's made of paper, like one bad word might tear her." He hadn't replied, but that evening, the girl found the flower. Something shifted after that. She began to watch him, not openly, but with the side of her eyes, like a deer learning the shape of a hunter who never raised a rifle. He brought her things, always without announcement. A book of Psalms left quietly on her windowsill, a cushion hand-stitched, placed beside her bench, a jar of honey from a farm, 3 towns away. Never a note, never a name, but his fingerprints were on every gift. In the quiet way they met a need before it was spoken. She never asked for help. He never offered it aloud. And somehow, that was exactly what made it safe. One morning, she stood behind the dressmaker's counteress. The freight man came in for a delivery. Their eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just paused on in that moment. Something unspoken passed between them. Not pity, not desire bait. Something pure, recognition. He knew pain when he saw it, not because he had caused it, but because he had carried it, and she saw it in him too. The kind of man who buried more than he shared, who knew the language of silence better than most preachers, knew scripture. She began leaving him things, too. A tin of coffee beside his wagon, a scarf hung over the post when the wind grew sharp, a folded paper with a Bible verse, slipped into the side of his satchel. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit. It wasn't a courtship, not like the stories in books or sermons. It was something slower, deeper, like water wearing, a waystone dash, patient, gentle, unyielding. And then came the Saturday fair, not the big one, with ribbons and judges, but the small kind. Pies on checkered cloths, music from a fiddle half in tune, and children racing with sticky hands. She was there, standing near the well, not sitting, not flinching, standing. He passed by with a crate in his arms, but paused long enough to set it down at her feet, opened it to reveal something. He had made a chair, not just any chair, cushioned with soft leather trimmed with braided sage, threaded curved at the back in a way that Sadai thought about what would make you feel safe. She didn't speak, but she sat. And this time, it didn't hurt. Sometimes, we meet people who teach us that love is not noise. It is not a rescue. It is the stillness beside you and the rest of the world walks away. The summer softened after the fair. The wind warmed. The sky held its blue longer before slipping into stars. And something in her posture changed, to not all at once but, like thawed snow, learning to flow again. She still sat alone some mornings, still stitched quietly in the dressmaker's back room, still walked with that measured gracious. If every step had once been a bruise, a bit, no longer was. But now, she watched for the sound of wagon wheels, listened for the low murmur of mules, and the creak of rope. Thought meant he was near. And when he passed, she didn't lower her eyes. She met his gaze with something fragile but growing. It was Mabel who brought them together one quiet afternoon. The little girl had cut her palm on a rusted nail while chasing fireflies near the fence. She cried, not from the pain, but from the blood, too red, too sudden, too much. The girl was the first to reach her, knelt in the dirt, tore a strip from her hem, and wrapped the tiny hand with the steadiness of someone new who had once tended to wounds that no one else would. He saw it from across the yard, came walking with a pace that was careful, not rushed. He took Mabel gently in his arms, offered no scolding, no fuss, only wiped her tears with a clean kerchief and asked the girl if she'd help him find a bandage in his wagon. They walked back to the cart together, the freight man, the girl, and Mabel between them. Tiny hand held by two that had both known what it was to bleed without being noticed. That evening, the sky swelled with thunder, not the sharp kind, but the slow roll kind that sounds like the earth remembering its grief. She was at the inn porch, watching the rain beat along the railings. He was inside, near the fire, hadn't spoken to her in days, not because of distance, but because sometimes silence is the only thing that doesn't feel like pressure. But tonight, something asked to be spoken. She stepped inside, damp around the shoulders, sat across from him in the old rocking chair, the Firelight caught in the hollows of her face, lit the faint scar above her eyebrow, and made her look older and, somehow, more innocent all at once. She didn't speak for a long time. Neither did he. The room held the hush of two people. Woe had both been afraid to be known, but had grown more afraid of being invisible then, softly so. Softly it felt like a thread unraveling. She said, "You don't ask anything of me." He looked at her, quiet as ever, and after a moment, shook his head once. She looked down at her hands. Most folks want something, a story, a confession, a promise. You just leave things, a chair, a jar, a verse. Still, he said nothing, so she continued, "I came here thinking it was work. The house was big, clean, the man was civil, his sons were quiet." She didn't need to say what came next, but she did. There were nights, and then there were bruises, and when I said no, he said I could leave if I liked, but not before I learned to be grateful. The fire snapped. He did not move. I told someone once, a boy who said he liked my eyes. Her voice faltered. He looked at me like I was dirty, like I'd handed him something broken. She looked up at him now, and her eyes weren't wet, just burning. "You never looked at me that way." He leaned forward, pulled something from his coat, a small carving rough palm-sized, in the shape of a sparrow. He placed it on the table between them, said only, "Birds with broken wings still fly." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of all the things she never got to say, of all the things he didn't need to hear in order to understand. She picked up the sparrow, ran her thumb along its crooked wing, and something in her just let go. The next morning, she found another gift at her door. Not flowers, not food, a journal, leather-bound, the first page blank, except for 5 words, "Write what they wouldn't hear." She did, late at night, with a candle flickering low. She wrote, not for justice, not for revenge, just to reclaim what had been taken by silence. She wrote about the night. She said no and was not believed. She wrote about the pain of walking without being asked where it hurt. She wrote about the freight man who listened without asking and stood without speaking. She filled every page with the softness of survival and the small, growing courage of being seen, and he kept showing up, never inside her space, never demanding her time, but always near. Fixing a shutter, before she noticed it, was loose, leaving a cup of tea when she coughed, building a birdhouse in the tree behind the inn. He never tried to hold her, but he built a world around her thought, made her feel held. One night, beneath the moonlight, she stepped out and found him sitting by the well. She sat beside him, not touching, just close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder, like a lighthouse in fog. "You believe me?" she said. He didn't say yes, didn't need to. She already knew, and that, somehow, was the most radical thing anyone had ever done. There is a kind of love that does not ask for anything but your truth, and when it hears that truth, it does not run, it stays. The world does not change all at once. Sometimes, it turns slowly, like a wagon wheel easing free from mud, or a long-held breath finally exhaled in Harlow Creek. Change began, not with a gunshot or sermon, but with a whisper finally spoken out loud. The fall fair arrived with banners made from old curtains, apple pies cooling on window sills, children with wild red cheeks, chasing one another through dusty alleys. She walked through the crowd with her shoulders higher now, not proud, but no longer folded. Her dress was still plain, her boots still patched, but there was something else about her, an ease in her spine, a steadiness in her pace. The townsfolk watched her pass, some with suspicion, some with discomfort, a few with guilt, but she didn't stop to explain herself, because some truths don't need permission to be carried. She noticed the girl first, no older than 14, carrying a tray of biscuits for the family she'd been hired to serve. The same house on the hill. The same family. The girl moved like a shadow, eyes down, too careful for her age, and when she stumbled slightly and dropped the tray, a man's hand reached out too fast, too hard, and gripped her wrist. The child didn't cry, she only flinched, and that was enough. The woman stepped forward, not quickly, not loudly, but without hesitation. The crowd had already turned their heads, pretending to see something else, just as they had done before. But this time, a voice rose into the warm autumn air, not angry, not accusing, just true. She flinched like I used to. Silence rolled through the fairgrounds like the hush before a storm. All eyes turned to her. She stood by the pie table. No podium, no preacher's blessing, only her truth. There was a time, she said, when I told someone it hurt to sit, and instead of asking why, they walked away. The wind caught her skirt. The sun touched her face, and still, she did not lower her gaze. I was not weak. I was not shameful. I was hurt. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A woman reached for her husband's hand. The blacksmith stood frozen, his jaw clenched like someone hearing a story he wished he'd never ignored. You all saw me, she continued, and chose not to look. And then softly she turned her face to the freight man standing just at the edge of the crowd. But one man did. He did not step forward. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Not his savior, not his shield, but his witness. The preacher's wife began to weep. A schoolteacher nodded, hand pressed to her chest. Even the innkeeper dabbed at her eyes with the edge of her apron, and the girl with the bruised wrist. She looked up for the first time, her eyes wide with something that might become hope. After the fair, no one said much, but things began to shift. Quietly. The house on the hill hired. No more girls. The town's doctor took more notice of quiet bruises, and on Sundays, the pew beside the girl was never empty. Not because she needed company, but because people had started remembering how to see. A few weeks later, she planted a garden behind the inn. Mint, sage, lavender. Things that grew slow, but came back stronger each season. The freight man built her a fence for it. Didn't say a word. Just worked with his coat off, sleeves rolled, eyes gentle. Sometimes she sat and wrote in her journal, the leather one he gave her. Sometimes she read aloud to Mabel, who claimed the butterflies liked the sound of her voice. Sometimes they sat together in silence. She in her chair, he on the step. They did not need to name what was between them, but it was there, rooted like the sage, unfolding like the lavender. One evening, as dusk brushed gold across the rooftops, she looked at him and said, "Do you think they believe me now?" He didn't speak, just reached out and gently took her hand, not with force, not with need, but with reverence, and that, she realized, was the only answer that mattered. The town moved on. New seasons came. Babies were born. Barns were raised. Life continued, as it always does. But somewhere near the edge of Harlow Creek, just past the bakery, there is a porch with a chair built by careful hands, and a woman who sits in it, not because she must, but because she can. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear her humming. Not a hymn, not a sorrow, but something new, something free. To anyone who has ever whispered a truth into a world too loud to hear you, know this: there is someone, somewhere, who will not look away, and when they do not, you will bloom.